Facebook's Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion, Maxine Williams, will come up on stage with TechCrunch Editor-in-Chief, Matthew Panzarino.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, morning, yes, now I'm on. Hi.
All right. This is my bad side, so, but it's okay. We'll be all right.
It's hard to see you all with the lights. You can see people right here.
I have dreams of stage stardom. This is just bringing it all back for me. Okay, so Maxine, let's, I think we were to start off the discussion a little broad. We can get more granular, because I think these discussions often do linger at the top level and sometimes don't get down into processes. And so I thought that in your position, you might have some interesting things to say about those processes. So, but let's start at the top, kind of set the scene. At Facebook especially, what are you doing and what have you found to be the best way to move the discussion and the tools that you use beyond the diversity related to specifically gender and race? So getting more granular in self-identification matters and other ways to help encourage awareness and then implement the processes to make sure that you're seeing those people.
So the first thing is, I think what we try to do is a yes and approach. So we want people to understand fundamentally that what we are seeking is to get more cognitive diversity on every team. That means having people who think differently, because the research has shown that if you're trying to solve complex problems, you will solve those better if you have more different ways of thinking among the people who are approaching the problems. It also shows that if you're trying to solve simple problems, you're okay with homogeneity because it's more efficient, it's easier to manage, but we don't see any of our problems as being simple ones. So on every team, we want people who think differently. When you start with that principle of cognitive diversity, it is easy to understand that you need a broad range of diversity. You want people with different personalities, people with all kinds of different backgrounds. However, when I say it's yes and, we lay the foundation with cognitive diversity as a principle, and then we talk about the programming. And the programming does, in fact, go heavier on things like gender, race, ethnicity, because I don't want people to ever feel like those are disconnected from your way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And I don't want people to think you're going to go so broad that we're going to take our eyes off of achieving more equity in those buckets. Mm-hmm. So we talk about it in a yes and way.
So you look for the diversity of background, which will inform the diversity of thinking, but you also don't want to divorce the two.
No, because I say that there's a very direct link between all of what you might describe. The ones you've just mentioned are sort of visible identity or what people think of as big bucket items, that there is a direct link between those and your cognitive diversity. So that as a practical matter, if we get those gaps closed, if we get more representation among those groups, we will also get more cognitive diversity.
So this might be reductive, so forgive me, but if let's say you're evaluating and you go, hey, we really need people who think differently to tackle this particular problem. How do you find out what diversity of thought is missing? Which facet is missing?
And that's where I say, as a practical matter, it is very hard to tell that in an interview environment, right? And this is where the issue of, this sort of the risk that comes with a dependence on referrals comes about, is because people tend to trust the people they know. So they'll say, oh, this person, I know them, right? They think really differently. They're always doing things out the box. The problem is when you do that at scale, you can't rely on that, and it doesn't give you enough different people, right? Because depending on what your base is, you're just going to get more people like them.
Yeah, you get a small amount of degrees of separation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we try not to do that, and we try to focus on a practical basis on, all right, we want people who think differently, and we want people in these different buckets. So let's focus on getting the people in those different buckets, and that will increase our cognitive diversity. Because if you go the other direction, my fear is that you end up getting people who look the same, even though they may think differently. But we could have people who look different and think differently. Right. So I want to go for that and get yes and on there too.
Okay. And what component of that is is focused on representation of Facebook's user base. So Facebook's user base is something, it's very almost evenly, matched gender-wise, I think. At a sample size that large, you would think, which seems to prove out. And then it's very diverse, obviously, racially. And other diversity is starting to kind of pop up there. So when you think about reflecting the user base, do you treat that as a one-to-one equation, or are there any correlations there?
So the fact that our user base is the whole world means that we see this imperative to become more diverse so that we can build the products and serve the people in the way that they want to be served, need to be served. We can build the right products. So for us, because our user base is so incredibly diverse and so broad, that's what allows us to understand the need for cognitive diversity so deeply. But we don't do a one-to-one relationship. Think of something as simple as the fact that 87% of the people who use Facebook are not in North America, right? That's huge. So cultural diversity matters deeply. But we have these practical constraints where most of the people who work for the company are in North America, right?
Right.
So, and it's all very, very complicated. It would be almost impossible to do the kind of mapping you're suggesting on one-to-one on every dimension when the world is who you serve.
And so when you look at the world and you look at people who are coming from very diverse locations around the world to work at Facebook, I think at top of mind right now is obviously immigration issues and things like that. So how has Trump's approach to this, such as it is on Twitter and elsewhere, affected your ability to recruit on a practical level, and then also your thoughts about being more or less aggressive there?
I mean, we can only do whatever we can within the law. So whether it's this administration or another administration, we hire who we can in every jurisdiction where we have employees. I don't know that we have a lot, there's no opinion that really matters in that. We just have to function under whatever the regulations are. And the truth is that, again, there's a kind of theoretical view and then there's a practical thing. The practical fact is that it is easier in some ways, let's just leave it at easier if you can hire people where you operate. I don't think that there's anybody in any company who particularly wants to go through extra hoops for hiring. So you look hard in the pool that is in your jurisdiction, and that is something that all of us do. When I talk about the fact, that's why I say that there are just simply practical constraints on ever doing a one-to-one mapping, is because if you are a company that has people from all over the world, it would be sort of practically impossible to have your recruiting strategy based on that because you have constraints like visas and immigration. And so for every company, if you can get people hired who have the skills you need with the perspectives, with the background outlook, without having to jump through those hoops, that's preferable, right?
Right. Okay, so I like this focus on practicality, so let's continue this. So there are obviously many philosophies about the pipeline issue, right? Where the pipeline starts, at which point it goes awry, so that many of the people that should end up before your eyes when you're hiring don't end up there. And I'm just curious about your thoughts into where along that scale do you feel is the most critical juncture for a company like Facebook who looks to hire diverse people with diversity of thought. Where's the broken kink in the pipe that's the worst? There are many breaks, it seems, but where is the biggest kink?
I think things fall into two buckets there. One is there's stuff you own and there's stuff you don't own. So the stuff you don't own is the long-term pipeline stuff, right? We don't have any say over what people learn in school. So that's long-term pipeline work, and that's one piece of it. What we do own is what happens once you get into our process. So we own how fair is our recruiting process, how fair is our hiring process. We own what happens once you get to the company. What is the culture that we have? Can it truly leverage inclusion to allow all of these different voices to be heard, to have the different perspectives now have an impact? So in terms, again, practically speaking, on what we can own and control, we invest a lot of time there. So yes, there are kinks everywhere and there are leaks everywhere in the pipeline, but most of our effort is in the stuff that we own. Like, let us weed out any bias that might exist. Let us train people to value difference. Let us have managers who know how to manage diverse teams. So we put most of our focus around the stuff we own, and then we do some investment around the stuff that happens in the longer term before you get into our process.
So let's workshop a scenario. So I'm a kid in, Ohio, right? Like I live in Fresno, for instance. There's a farm town. It's about 800,000, so it's not like super dinky, or maybe 500,000 plus, and then the greater area is 800. So it's not super dinky, but it often feels greatly divorced from Silicon Valley, even though it's just over the mountains, right? One of the things that I felt growing up was that I loved technology and felt very passionate about it, but the gaps were so much larger because it felt like a chasm between me, and I had a lot of advantages. I'm white, I'm a dude, I had a decent family, it's an atomic unit, they didn't divorce, so a lot of advantages along the way, but still felt like there was a large chasm. The internet has seemed to reduce that. I wouldn't be here, if the internet didn't exist. So I'm curious about if you think of ways to sort of shorten the gaps between people who are outside of the Stanford ecosystem or outside of the typical lines where you go, hey, this has sort of been a good pre-vet that you've got the basics we're looking for. But how do you go beyond that to the person who has the passion, and has the talent, and has the desire, but may not be in those orbits? How do you reach out to them?
So your question is, how do you reach out to the second person you've described, not the young kid?
Well, I think a young kid who is growing up in an area that is not touching directly any of the known orbits that lead into engineering programs at Stanford and et cetera.
Okay. So two types of people, and this is where I talk about our track as well, where we do some investment in the long term, but really focus on what happens once you come into our orbit. So in the long term, we have created something called Tech Prep. And Tech Prep was created, it's an online resource that anybody could use, where it connects the dots for both learners and their parents or guardians. We did all this research, and so, we hired people who went into urban centers. We interviewed particularly people of color, their families, the learners, the parents, the guardians, and saw that people had an interest in computers but didn't really know what that was, right? So this is a chasm you're talking about. Parents of color had a stronger belief in their children's ability to do well in a computer-oriented profession than majority parents, right? And that was an interesting thing. Like, here we have people who have not been so beaten down that they have lost hope. But what they said was, in 83% of the cases, they said, I don't know how to get my child there. So we saw again that there was a need for a practical roadmap. And so Tech Prep is something which now hundreds of thousands of people have used, which says, here is what a profession is like in technology. Here are the skills you need. Here's how much money you would make. And here are where you can get training. Here are the areas in your neighborhood. You can put in your zip code. And then it tells you where you can go. It says, are you a beginner? Are you middle? Are you an experienced person that you need a little extra boost? And so it provides a roadmap. I think people that's what people need. Life is hard and complicated, and you're juggling a million other things. And so you have this thing in the back of your mind. Maybe you've heard of it. But if you had a roadmap, and it's what other people, maybe in your situation, may have had the opportunity to get more naturally because of the unit you came from or what was in your environment, but there are many of us who didn't have that. And giving people a simple roadmap then allows them to get a little further along the way. So Tech Prep is something that we're really proud of, which we think goes some distance to doing that. But then, if we fast forward, and then we have a great partnership with code.org as well, where we saw, okay, young kid, if you get some exposure, you can start to build up, but then what happens? And we saw that you were 10 times more likely to do computer science if you did AP-CS. But people of color were not doing AP-CS. So in Mississippi, where 50% of the high school students are black, not a single black person took the AP exam last year. It's just, wow. It's so phenomenally, talk about a chasm, right? And from a practical perspective, it's difficult for me to get into why that's happening, but what I can start to do is try to change what is happening. So with code.org, we have a relationship now which is trying to get more people of color and more women to take the exam and become proficient by adding to training, helping to train teachers, etc. All sorts of pieces of that puzzle. And then Once you have some skills and you say, well, then how do you get into the system? It's about having a fair system. Like actually publishing all the jobs you have as opposed to having jobs which some people know about and
right.
give it to people you know. I'm not into that people you know thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm into skills you have.
Right.
And so...
Well, the person you know is not going to do the job.
Well, they might, but I want the person who I don't know who could do the job, right? Because they are bringing perspectives we don't already have. Mm-hmm. So it's about having a more fair system. We have relationships with all sorts of partners, MLT, and we go to SHIP and NESB, like all of these places to get people who are not already well represented. So it's a whole complex thing, but very focused on the practical.
So there is I think a reluctance, or not a reluctance necessarily, but perhaps people just don't get there, a desire to talk about tools. So the tools that you use inside and how you develop the tools to see what you're missing and then suss out what you're missing and then find those people and then also to evaluate diversity within the organization. I think more specifically that. So can you explain a little bit about the tool building process and how those tools are constructed and evaluated?
Yes, the tools are the least sexy thing ever. So nobody ever asks about them, so thank you for asking about them. Again, you're all going to be sick of this word, practical. But there's a big difference between saying, we're going to do X, and being able to actually operationalize X. And in between there, tools and tracking become really important instruments. So let's say that you decide that you want to do name an internship program, mm-hmm. right? This is a program that most companies have. And how do you fill your internships with as much diversity as possible? Well, you have to be able to know what's my baseline right now, right? How is that tracking? When we have people come in as freshmen, you're making decisions all the time, right? If you have people come in as freshmen, let's say you do a freshman internship versus a sophomore internship, what is the probability that people who do the freshman internship are going to come back as full-time employees versus people who did a sophomore internship? Because again, on a practical level for a company, you're trying to see, how can I hire these people? Right? You are trying to invest in the general pool because it's better for all of us the more people there are with these skills. But you are also keeping in mind, I want all of these people, right?
Right.
I want them to come here. How do I do that? And so the more ability you have to track, to project, to do workforce planning, mm-hmm. The better you're going to be able to convert these people. And so every step of every program, you need a particular set of tools to forecast, to track, and then to see how you invest, right? How do you stay in touch with these people? You need another set of tools for that. You talk about identification. Again, you have to do only what is allowable within the law. So on a theoretical plane, one will say, you have 100 jobs, just hire all people from X group, whatever protected characteristic you think is underrepresented. Mm-hmm. But practically, that's not how companies are allowed to operate, right? And then you have to walk back from there and say, okay, what tools do you use to identify? If you have people, there is this view of blind applications perhaps being good against bias. Mm-hmm.
And that's an application with perhaps no name or identifying characteristics.
Nothing. And then if you go, like in the UK, they're trying to take out zip codes because there's class bias or area codes, right? All those things.
Yeah.
So if you have a blind application, then theoretically you say, oh, good, now bias won't operate as much and we see more underrepresented people getting through. But if you have a deliberate interest in filling your pipeline with people who are underrepresented, then how do you know who they are if the thing is blind? Mm-hmm. So every decision you make requires some support for tracking, projecting, mm-hmm. and measuring ROI. And then you want to be nimble as well. You want to be able, if I've tried something for a couple of years and it isn't moving my needle, then let me deprecate and let me try something else. But you have to have tracked that and measured it against ROI to know whether you're going to take that out and put something else in.
Right.
So all of it requires a sort of complex tools and tracking.
Yeah. We do have a couple of questions. If you don't mind, I could talk about this for another hour, but we have a couple of questions.
We do. We actually had quite an incredible turnout, as you've seen me kind of hanging on the side of the stage. So the first question, well, I know we're getting tight on time, so we'll do a couple if that's all right. Why did Facebook's board recently vote against gender pay equity review?
Essentially, we do really rigorous reviews consistently around pay equity. And that was more of a question of where that mandate should sit. So it's not that we are not doing the work, it's that we didn't think that it should sit in where it would based on that proposal. I'm going to try to keep my answer shorter than I did for you so we can get through more questions.
Great, thank you. The second, you are working for diversity at Facebook, but the platform includes groups that are homophobic and racist. Does that represent a challenge for you?
See, this is where not having the actual person is hard, because I don't know what is meant by the platform includes. I assume you mean the people who use the product. Yes. And since, as we were talking about, the people who use the product are people all over the world from, like, with all sorts of different backgrounds and opinions and points of view. And, yeah, some of it is not good. And so where we sit on that is that we take really strong lines against hate speech, and we try to put community standards which balance freedom of speech and hate speech, and to weed out what is hate speech from the platform.
Thank you. And lastly, reading from the individual who submitted, I'm a black man. I've gotten to the final round of Facebook interviews 3 times for different roles. If it's a close call between candidates, should a minority get precedent?
This is where the law comes into it. And that the legal position is that you're not allowed to hire on the basis of a protected characteristic such as race. However, if you are a company that prioritizes, that values diversity, then I think the correct guidance is you are looking for a whole person who brings things that are going to be assets to that company, so that if this person has the skills, meets the qualifications, is a great candidate, and is underrepresented, then they are a better candidate because they bring more to the table.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you for listening.